Hi, this presentation is about a topic that is not related to my current research field, but it is still about an author I like. More importantly, in general, when I conduct research, I try my best to provide a new perspective on the topic I am working on. Therefore, I chose to make this presentation about a paper that I wrote in the past, in which I proposed a new hypothesis about Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart. And I hope I will not later discover that someone else has written about the same hypothesis. This is possible because this is a very famous work. Also, I want to emphasize that what I will present here is just a hypothesis. At any rate, the name of my work is From the Black Cauldron to the White Page, The Witch as a Narrator of Poe's The Telltale Heart. So, Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart is a famous short story of crime fiction first published in 1843. The tale starts with an unnamed and unreliable narrator addressing an unknown person, often regarded as the reader, about the details of a crime that the narrator had committed in the past. Many details, such as the relationship between the narrator and the victim, who happened to be an old man, the motivation behind the crime, the gender of the narrator, and many other related issues are not sufficiently explained in the story. Nevertheless, critics um, have provided various ideas and interpretations as to what remained ambiguously unstated in the story. This presentation aims to look at the story from a new, different perspective. That's to say, this study will point to the possibility that the narrator could be a young female servant who is secretly involved in some witchcraft practices. This hypothesis will be established by highlighting relevant ritual elements in the tale, which suggest that the narrative includes more than a mere portrayal of a perfect crime. Additionally, before launching into the examination of the story, this paper will review some critics' significant suppositions as well as interpretations of some inexplicit notions of the story. Again, as I said, we don't know the real gender of the narrator. However, given that the narrator said that his or her motive of the crime was neither from hate nor a need for money, but rather from a suspenseful fear of the victim's pale blue eye. So I just want to talk speedily about this specific organ. In general, in such context, and before talking about the main fictional work itself, I'd like to provide a historical background about the main issue in the work. That's why, as you can see on the slide, um, I started with a reference to Plato regarding the eye, or to be more correct, about Socrates, because Socrates is the one who is talking, which says, quote, there is no sense organ which more closely resembles the sun, truth, in my opinion, than the eye, end of quote. And this shows the mysterious aspect of this particular entity. Later, Galen, for example, who examined the human organs, called it the divine tool. And to go outside from the scope of this study, we can also remember Ibn Arabi's idea about the eye, even though Ibn Arabi's notion doesn't seem to have any direct connection with Poe. Yet I just liked to refer to him here. For this great philosopher, seeing is not just a physical act, it symbolizes spiritual insight. In other words, the eye of the heart, or as known in Arabic, al-basira, allows one to perceive beyond surface appearances, gaining insight into the deeper, interconnected reality of all things as manifested by God. Let me confess and say that it was after reading Ibn Arabi's Ibn Arabi's idea about the eye, the hypothesis of this study came to my mind back then, especially the following couplet. Quote, فالعين واحدة والحكم مختلف وذاك السر لأهل العلم ينكشف. The essence or the eye is one, yet judgment differ. This is a secret revealed to those with the true knowledge. End of quote. However, this doesn't mean that there is no Islamic impact on Edgar Allan Poe at all. Edgar Allan Poe's works contain a few potential references to Islamic themes or sources, such as his poem Al-A'raf, which is a place mentioned in the Quran, as well as references to the Arabian Nights. There is also a possible reference to Halumiyat ibn Khaldun, or to its original source, that's to say, Al-Majrit is Ghayat al-Hakim, the goal of the wise, even though this book was later discovered that it was not attributed to Al-Majriti. However, which is hinted at the first stanza of his famous poem, The Raven, which, as far as I know, no scholar has ever noticed or talked about. In other words, according to me, maybe this is totally wrong, but according to me, the quote, volume of forgotten lore, end of quote, may refer to Al-Majriti's book, known in the West by Picatrix. This famous alchemical and magical work was translated into Latin from the 12th century, and it was famous in the West, and it was referred to by many scholars, such as Agrippa and others. I mean, according to me, what the narrator was doing at the beginning of this poem, The Raven, was reading this specific book in which he read the alchemical recipe where a person must utter specific words repeatedly, very shortly before sleeping, so that a vision of what that person is seeking would be formed in their mind afterwards. They used to call it Al-Halumiyya, and there's other names, Halumiyya or Halimiyya or something like this. And I imagine Poe would use the word nevermore in doing his own Halumiyya, and hence the poem started to be formed from that very turning point. It all seems to occur in the fraction of a second between wakefulness and sleep. I mean, where he, quote, nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, end of quote. However, you can read Edgar Allan Poe's The Philosophy of Composition, specifically the place where he stated that he purposely used this specific word, nevermore, for its melodic sound and effect. Furthermore, given that this poem has magical elements, it would not be out of context to imagine Poe reading a famous book about magic while he composed it. At any rate, let's go back to the topic of this study. So, this study will review the story in light of the present argument, claiming that the narrator of the story is not only a female servant to the old man of the house, but also an undercover witch. Consequently, the reason for murdering him could be related to the power of his vulture eye to unveil the girl's dark and hidden secrets. Indeed, there are such implications in the story. Even before minutely looking into the story, we know that Poe was born in Boston, Massachusetts, and died in Baltimore, Maryland, both not so far from the well-known site where the famous, or rather the infamous, Salem witch trials took place. The memory of this horrible event was still alive in Poe's time. Furthermore, many scholars, such as Kristen Houghton, accept the hypothesis that this specific short story was based on the 1830 murder of Joseph White, which also happened in Salem. So, Poe, like his contemporary Nathaniel Hawthorne, in the Scarlet Letter, might have been inspired by the atrocities that occurred in Salem. It would be constructive to refer to some critics' relevant arguments before starting to analyze the story based on its witchcraft implications. A similar hypothesis was somehow argued regarding some of Poe's characters. For instance, some critics looked at Lady Madeline Usher in Poe's other story, The Fall of the House of Usher, as a vampire. Actually, as Harold Bloom, who personally experienced this exceptionally unique and dreadful traumatic element in Poe's weird stories, asserted, quote, everyone in Poe is more or less a vampire, end of quote. In light of such possibilities, looking at the narrator of The Telltale Heart as a witch should be less surprising. As for the narrator's gender, Gita Rajan's feminist reading assumed that, quote, unmarked narrator can be seen as female, end of quote. Rajan interpreted the narrator as a daughter desiring her own father, as well as seeking power. More importantly, Rajan asserted that the narrator's gender is not clearly identified in the text. Likewise, she provided her own interpretation of the narrator's critical phrase, quote, would a madman have been so wise as this, end of quote, which I will refer to later when I analyze the story. However, according to Robert Cohn Davis, Davis's masculinist reading, the narrator and the victim are, quote, indeed doubles, always ready, always already connected by the gaze, end of quote. Davis highlighted the two characters' analogous, quote, almost chronically sensitive hearing and sight, insomnia, and a preoccupation with death, end of quote, while the eye of the victim represent the symbolic law of the father. But it is interesting that based on Davis' reading, the murder of the old man symbolizes the act of Oedipal mastery. Correspondingly, Daniel Hoffman took the old man to be a father figure, with his eye caught, which a child most likely fears, the suspicion that he has been seen in a forbidden act, end of quote. Arthur Robinson is of the opinion that the victim's evil eye is actually the evil eye. Just to be clear, I mean I as in myself, not I the organ. In other words, the narrator sees himself in that eye and thus tries to escape it. Another interesting point was tackled by Zret Zimmerman, who refused the typical reading of the tale as a confession. Instead, Zimmerman insisted that the narrator has, quote, already confessed to the murder of the old man who was his former living companion. The tale then is not so much a confession as a courtroom defense, end of quote. To strengthen that argument, Zimmerman examined the narrator's rhetorical mastery, which according to him is similar to Marvel's Ahab, Shakespeare's evil characters, and the devil of Milton's Paradise Lost. Quote, Poe, like Milton and Melville, also recognizes that bad men could speak well, end of quote. In short, providing a conclusive result about Poe's tales is not an easy task. Nevertheless, the following hypothesis is worth considering. The Telltale Heart opens with the following confusing statement. Quote, true, nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous I had been and am. But why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. End of quote. So The whole story is compressed, so to speak, in the very first word of the story, where we have a glimpse pointing towards a truth to know or something hidden to fathom. This truth, most of all, is related to the narrator's real identity, which we start reflecting upon before we even consider the nature of the crime and its motive. Furthermore, the preternatural ability of hearing, poetically described by the narrator, refers to the possible presence of occultism, or at least a kind of untraditional, untraditional way of supernatural cognition. Hence, we are required to think this before accusing the narrator of being mad, since the narrator's main goal from the entire narrative is for her to dispel this accusation. Such unique auditory or intuitional powers had been noticed in many intellectuals of untraditional thought, whether they were magicians, alchemists, or even philosophers. A famous example can be seen in John Donne's Conversations with Angels, as well as Socrates' intuitional whispering demon. Similarly, the narrator's frequent neurotic behavior could be linked to a type of a demonic possession. And if it is so, then the narrator's detailed report could be seen as a confession made to some priest for the sake of setting her soul free, or something like this. Needless to say, her general rhetoric, as well as her recurrent hysterical laughter during the course of the narration, is similar to that of a witch. This issue is comparable to a famous literary work related to witchcraft. That's to say, it can be compared to the witches in Shakespeare's Macbeth, namely in the three witches' poetic language and sarcastic behavior. Similarly, they often laughed fanatically and likewise used speech that concealed deep hidden meanings. However, after the narrator promises to demonstrate, quote, how healthily, how calmly, end of quote, she would tell the story so that she would convince us that she is not mad. She says, quote, it is impossible to say how first the idea entered my brain, but once conceived, it haunted me day and night. Object, there was none. Passion, there was none. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me. He had never given me insult. For his gold, I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. He had the eye of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold. And so, by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man, and thus rid myself of the eye forever. Thus, the idea that entered her brain, often considered as the idea of the murder, could also refer to a thing that she started thinking about shortly before she made up her mind regarding her criminal project. Based on this reading, the idea that haunted her day and night was the idea that the old man could know and consequently reveal something about her dark practices. And it was this possible threat that produced her decision of killing him before being witch hunted. That idea, as Johann Palya comments, is quote, ghostly and persistent and of obscure purpose, end of quote. Therefore, and also as Johann Palya comments, the vulture eye reminds the narrator of, quote, a carrion-eating bird, which suggests that death is imminent, end of quote. In other words, the old man's eye reminds the narrator of her possible death, where her corpse would be left for the vultures. That is why, whenever that eye fell upon her, her blood ran cold. This undoubtedly implies the cold temperature of a corpse. Having said that, the narrator goes on, quote, "Now this is the point. You fancy me mad. Madmen know nothing," end of quote. This phrase, as Pilia suggests, is a thrust at the reader. That's to say, it doesn't refer to the narrator, but to the reader. Then the narrator narrates in considerable depth how she did the deed. Quote, "And every night, about midnight, I turned the latch of his door and opened it. Oh, so gently. And then, when I had made an opening sufficient for my head, I put in a dark lantern, all closed, that no light shone out. And then I thrust in my head. Oh, you would have laughed to see how cunningly I thrust it in. I moved it slowly, very, very slowly, so that I might not disturb the old man's sleep. It took me an hour to place my whole head within the opening so far that I could see him as he lay upon his bed." End of quote. The phrase regarding the time of her nocturnal visits, about midnight, she said, later was fixed into at midnight, and finally to the specific phrase just at 12. That time implies a ritual aspect of the deed. As Pelia comments, the old idea hunted her by day and night, and as a result, she hunts the old man. She even provides detailed information concerning her ambiguous long spying on her victim. Quote, "And then, when my head was well in the room, I undid the lantern cautiously, oh, so cautiously, for the hinges creaked. I undid it just so much that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye. And this I did for 7 long nights, every night just at midnight, but I found the eye always closed, and so it was impossible to do the work, for it was not the old man who vexed me, but his evil eye." End of quote. Another implication about the ritual dimension of her practice can be seen in the number of days that she spent before her crime. For 7 nights, just at 12, she said, quote, "Just at 12, I looked in upon him while he slept," end of quote, using her, and I'm using her own words. The number 7 is holy in all the Abrahamic religions, as well as in most ancient cultures, like the Greek Pythagoreans and the Mesopotamians, for its connection to the days of the week and the 7 planets. And therefore, it was used in black magic and witchcraft. So the old man's eye, according to the later part of the narration, has some mystical power that could reach the very core of things in rather unconditional way. Unlike normal eyes, which are often distracted by the outer world, this eye, quote, "with a film over it," end of quote, might be able to see the truth in a very clear manner. Therefore, the narrator accuses it of being an evil eye. In other words, it reminds her of her own dark side, evil eye. And from the perspective that only the like can recognize the like, so she resolves to deal with this hazard in her own unique occultist approach. No matter how, after long days of dark plotting, the waited moment finally arrives. Caught upon the 8th night, I was more than usually cautious in opening the door. A watch's minute hand moves more quickly than did mine. Never before that night I had felt the extent of my own powers, of my sagacity. I could scarcely contain my feelings of triumph, to think that there I was opening the door little by little, and he not even to dream of my secret deeds or thoughts. I fairly chuckled at the idea. End of quote. The fact that I, she utters quote, I felt the extent of my own power, of my sagacity, end of quote, asserts assert again the nature of her ritual, namely the growing dark energy she receives after 7 nights of in sneaking in is finally complete. And her power includes her mystical knowledge of what could be going in his mind at that critical time. Quote, he not even to dream of my secret deeds, end of quote, she says. In this sense, any reference to watch, which is repeated in the tale, can be replaced by which. We can just change one letter. So the watch's hand is a pun of the witch's hand. At any rate, when the narrator, quote, was about to open the lantern, when my thumb slipped upon the tin fastening, and the old man sprang up in bed, crying out, who is there? I kept quite still and said nothing. For a whole hour, I did not move a muscle, and in the meantime, I did not hear him lie down. He was still sitting up in the bed, listening, just as I have done night after night, hearkening to the death watches in the wall. End of quote. The last sentence could refer to some ancient superstition that seeing death watch beetles is a sign of impending death. Yet, as a pun, it could refer to the death of witches that existed in the narrator's dreadful thoughts, as was stated earlier. At any rate, the terror did not stop. Uh, Her next long yet sensual imagery provoking description can provide some hint about what is happening in her mind. Quote, presently I heard a slight groan, and I knew it was the groan of mortal terror. It was not a groan of pain or of grief. Oh no, it was the low, stifled sound that arises from the bottom of the soul when overcharged with awe. I knew the sound well. Many a night, just at midnight, when all the world slept, it has welled up from my own bosom, deepening with its dreadful echo. The terrors that distracted me, I say I knew it well. I knew what the old man felt and pitied him. Although I chuckled at heart, I knew that he had been lying awake ever since the first slight noise when he had turned in the bed. His fears had been ever since growing upon him. He had been trying to fancy them causeless, but could not. He had been saying to himself, it is nothing but the wind in the chimney. It is only a mouse crossing the floor, or it is merely a cricket which has made a single chirp. End of quote. Thus, she emphasizes her full knowledge of that sound, which she knew, as she said, many a night just at midnight when all the world slept. And end of her words. So, this invites the reader to imagine an atmosphere and time of a frenzy witchcraft practices. On the one hand, her description of the old man's exact thought further asserts her occult knowledge. This issue reminds us of Shakespeare's relevant play. For example, when the first witch told Macbeth about the first apparition, she affirmed to him that, quote, he knows thy thought, end of quote. On the other hand, the narrator's various references to many insects and animals tell us about the dominant presence of these things in her mind. For example, next to the mouse and the cricket, she elsewhere referred to vulture and spider, not to forget the beetles of the death watches. And this again pushes us to draw an analogy with Shakespeare's play. For instance, the three witches faced by Macbeth were throwing cat, hedgepig, toad, as well as a liver, a nose, and lips of a human being, along with many other things, into the cauldron. Therefore, the narrator must have been familiar with such sacrificial rites. Continuing with her rhetorical demonstration of the old man's state of mind shortly before his death, she argues that he felt that death was approaching and, quote, it was the mournful influence of the unperceived shadow that caused him to feel, although he neither saw nor heard, to feel the presence of my head within the room, end of quote. This clearly expounds the old man's ultra intuitional ability springing from his eye, which used to threaten unveiling the narrator's hidden side. The idea of losing one eye for the sake of gaining supernatural power can be clearly seen in the story of Odin. Additionally, the idea of losing sight completely to become wiser is explained in the stories of Oedipus as well as the blind Homer. Due to this part of the story can be read in such a context. Also, the old man's pale blue eye create a sense of nature that is a primitive lifestyle far from national thinking, which can only see the appearance of things. Therefore, by damaging this eye of truth, so to speak, the problem would be solved. But of course, her aim is to ritually take this power before murdering the old man. Anyway, quote, when I had waited a long time, very patiently, without hearing him lie down, I resolved to open a little, very little crevice in the lantern. So I opened it. You cannot imagine how stealthily, until at length a simple dim ray, like the thread of the spider, shot from out of the crevice and fell upon the vulture eye. It was open. End of quote. Here, the purpose of her rituals becomes clearer. Her main intention is obviously to disarm this mystical eye, and that can be attained by drowning it with light. That's to say, to transfer its power and to make it like any other normal eye. In other words, she desires to make the eye distracted by the sense of vision in order to undo its irrational capacity. For example, when Socrates spoke about how he deserted the natural sciences, he mentioned how some people were fooled by the world of appearances, while other while others ruined their eyes by looking at the sun. Quote, I was afraid I might be completely blinded in my soul by looking at objects with my eyes and trying to lay hold of them with each of my senses. So I thought I should take refuge in theories and study the truth of matters in them. End of quote. All the same, the narrator becomes furious as she gazed upon the eye. Quote, I saw it with perfect distinctness, all a dual blue, with a hideous veil over it that chilled the very marrow in my bones. But I could see nothing else of the old man's face or person, for I had directed the ray as if by instinct precisely upon the damned spot. There came to my ears a low, dull, quick sound, such as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I knew that sound well, too. It was the beating of the old man's heart. It increased my fury as the beating of a drum stimulates the soldier into courage. End of quote. If one just replaced the word watch with which, the idea would be cloudless. Then the phrase would be as follows. Quote, a quick sound such as a witch makes when enveloped in cotton. End of quote. Namely, she is familiar with the sound that occurs while burning a witch. That fits the same description. This could also take place in her wild nightmares. She is seized by anxiety of the sound of his heart, which she fears would be heard by the neighbors. Thus, she realizes quote, that the quote, old man's hour had come. End of quote. The next details are very important. Quote, with a loud yell, I threw open the lantern and leaped into the room. He shrieked once, only. He shrieked once only. In an instant, I dragged him to the floor and pulled the heavy bed over him. I then smiled gaily to find the deed so far done. End of quote. This strange moment of possession, according to Rajan, has a somewhat dark purpose within it. In other words, the narrator here forces the old man to receive her, so that, quote, he shrieked once only, end of quote. I think um, I think you understood what is referred to here. Needless to say, the ritualistic aspect of that terrible act should be added to the last hypothesis. Having killed the old man, quote, I dismembered the corpse. I cut off the head and the arms and the legs. I then took up 3 planks from the flooring of the chamber and deposited all between the scantlings. I then replaced the boards so cleverly, so cunningly, that no human eye, not even his, could have detected anything wrong. End of quote. First of all, the last sentence assert that the old man's eye has some supernatural power. Furthermore, the emphasis on this specific number should not be overlooked. The dismemberment included 3 areas, and likewise, she particularly, quote, took up 3 planks from the flooring, end of quote, and hid the corpse. This must be a pivotal part of her rituals um, against the Holy Trinity. The 3 witches in Macbeth were dancing in a circle and singing, quote, the weird sisters hand in hand, posters of the sea and land. Thus do go about thrice to thine and thrice to mine. End of quote. The witches' practices in Shakespeare's mentioned play were thrice repeated. Also, we should remember that when the second apparition said, quote, Macbeth, 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 end of quote, Macbeth answered, quote, had I 3 ears, I'd hear thee, end of quote. Accordingly, such an analogy is obvious. However, the narrator goes on, though, quote, there was nothing to wash out, no stain of any kind, no blood spot, whatever. I had been too wary for that. A tube had caught all. Ha ha. End of quote. This description implies many indications regarding the gender of the narrator. Hypothetically, if the murderer was a man, he would have carried the corpse and buried it elsewhere, at least in the garden, as seen in most crime stories at that time. But since she was a young girl, thus that was out of the question for her. So she hides the corpse right under the floor of the same room. For example, in Edgar Allan Poe's The Black Cat, or his other short story, the twin of this tale, the male narrator, after having committed his murder and without doing any act of dismemberment, just deposited the corpse, quote, against the inner wall, end of quote. So, the significance of the act of dismemberment is twofold. Firstly, it refers to a woman. Secondly, it refers to a ritual. In this sense, it would also be relevant to remember that in the end of the Black Cat, the narrator's hidden identity was, or his crime was revealed to people by the, quote, solitary eye, end of quote, cat. And that strengthens the narrator's fear of the old man's eye, as argued many times before. Notwithstanding her ability to cut the body as well as to erase every stain of blood from the scene implies a female character who is familiar um, with the kitchen instruments at the time. Above all, uh, uh, above all that, the way she dealt with the blood could also looked at based on her possible ritualistic tendency. Not to forget that the reader is not told strictly what she eventually did with the blood. Having done that, she states, quote, when I had made an end of these labors, it was 4 o'clock, still dark as midnight. As the bell sounded the hour, there came a knocking at the street door. There entered 3 men who introduced themselves with perfect suavity as officers of the police. A shriek had been heard by a neighbor during the night. Suspicion of a foul play had been aroused. Information had been lodged at the police office, and they, the officers, had been deputed to search the premises. The shriek I said was my own in a dream. End of quote. Another pertinent point to be highlighted here is the fact that the narrator spent 3 hours to complete her crime. As was mentioned earlier, she started just at 12, then she remained in the dark room for a whole hour, that is until 1 o'clock, and exactly at 4 o'clock the police came. Consequently, this timing is not a coincidence in terms of its relation to her rituals. As for her alibi of the shriek, as taking place while she was dreaming, it also implies her state of mind, since only a person who is often haunted by the idea of being caught in the wrong deed and likewise punished would generally do that during their nightmares. Likewise, the fact that 3 men come to the house refers to the way her evil plan is encountered by a holy twist of fate. Furthermore, after behaving as if there is nothing wrong and adding insult to injury, she stated that she brought chairs into the room and desired them here to rest from their fatigues, while I myself, in the wild audacity of my perfect triumph, placed my own seat upon the very spot beneath which reposed the corpse of the victim. End of quote. After trying to act calm and innocent, she remarks that, quote, I felt myself getting pale and wished them gone. My head ached, and I fancied a ringing in my ear. End of quote. She started hearing strange voices. Quote, the sound increased, and what could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound, much such a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard it not. End of quote. In this sense, her sudden paranoia expresses a reaction from the punishment in store for her. She was not able to resist the power of truth in front of the representation of the Trinity. Thus, she collapsed and confessed her crime. Quote, Almighty God, no, no, they heard, they suspected, they knew, they were making a mockery of my horror. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die. And now again, hark, louder, louder, louder. Villains, I shrieked. Dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the blanks. Here, here. It is the beating of his hideous heart. End of quote. Consequently, at the end, she exchanged the thing of which she used to fear with the actual fear quote of the penal system, to use Rajan's words. Knowing that the narrator's psychological behavior in this final moment is shaped, so to speak, by her much earlier act of ritual dismemberment. As Johann Pelia noticed, when the narrator collapses, she is caught, rapidly disarticulated into three uncontrollable twitching fragments. End of quote. First, the narrator's speech stems from the head, becoming vehement, foaming, raven, swearing, etc. Second, the narrator's arms are gesticulating violently and swinging the chair. Thirdly, the narrator's legs are rising furiously and excitedly, pacing the floor to and fro with heavy strides. These symptoms are related to the nature of the earlier dismemberment. It is interesting that she even tells us three times that the old man is dead, and that emphasizes the ritualistic aspect of her crime. To sum up, the female narrator of the Total Heart, whose fits were often accompanied by seizures, violent fears, and uncontrollable panic attacks, which could be understood in relationship with the discussed dark practices, must have been a young servant to the victim. Yet the motivation of her crime stems from the possibility that he could reveal her true character to others. The aforementioned analysis succeeded in highlighting many dark ritualistic behaviors performed by the narrator based on her own report. Moreover, it connected these behaviors with their resemblant counterparts found in literary and historical books. In this sense, it would be interesting to consider the final scene of the story from its religious dimension. The young witch is sitting in the middle of the room and in front of the three men, the representation of the Holy Trinity, feeling that they are strongly judging her. And in such a hard judgment session, she confesses her under pressure. She had to confess. Her words, quote, "Oh God, what could I do?" Or, quote, "Almighty God, no, no," end of quote, are confirmation that she fails in running away from her evil deed. But just because she is caught red-handed in her fragile emotional state does not necessarily mean that she changes. Her final articulated rude vocabulary, as well as her screaming in addressing the three policemen, implies that her soul remains rebellious until the end. Thus, her final dark act was to transfer her own crime in a kind of celebrated manner to the pure white page, which was probably delivered to the death row chaplain before her execution. Finally, uh, looking at the narrator as a witchy, beautiful young girl with such a poetic tongue and mastermind who is about to face her death for her wrong deed, even corresponds more or less with Poe's conviction regarding the most sad and beautiful thing for an author to write about. Quote, "The death of a beautiful woman is unquestionably the most poetic topic in the world." End of quote. And here are the references. Uh, Thanks for listening. Um, I wish you all a heart filled with peace and empty from such beats of conscience.